Hi, welcome to this week's episode of the Wellbeing Show. I'm Noel, I'm your host. Um, I've got Ruth with me today. She's going to introduce herself properly soon. We're going to have as she describes it, a good old natter about stuff. Sort of mostly about her, to be honest, and a little bit about me. And because she's got some other broken old down old bloke in her life that she's taking off to Benidorm soon. So she seems to have an interest in broken old blokes like me. So lucky me, eh? Just to remind you, this is a pre-record, so if you're listening to this, don't immediately call me if you've got a question, because I might be doing something else and you might get grumpy old Noel in response. But send me a message. You're welcome to send me a message on WhatsApp 07506 319 745. And if you've got any questions for Ruth, I'm happy to pass them on, or she might even give you a way of contacting her. But again, do it by message as opposed to an excited phone call because she'll be in Benidorm, I think, and she's promised not to take her computer, so I don't want loads of people calling her while she's on holiday. Anyway, enough with me. Hi, Ruth. Welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Good, thanks. Thanks for inviting me on.
Oh, no, it's good to have you here. And where are you at the moment?
I'm in Staffordshire.
Right. It's very sunny where you are by the looks of it, which is great.
Blue sky, lovely.
And you're practicing, getting in practice for sunny Benidorm beaches by the looks of it, which is
Exactly. I got my suntan, factor, is it now 80 rather than 50 or
I
30?
whatever 1 million for me. I come
Yeah,
from Irish stock, so I need sort of nuclear sort of protection when it comes to sun stuff.
exactly.
And you're a doctor, right?
Yes, and so although we were joking then about what factor, it is really important for people
Yeah,
to wear suntan lotion when they go abroad. So yes, I have got some in my bag, but maybe not factor 80.
yeah. I think is it 80 is the most, or is it 50? I usually
I
get 50.
think 50 is the most, so I
I
was
get
just
the ones for kids because that seems to fit me best. Fits my style, if you like. So put it on and keep it on. So you're a ex-GP, I believe.
Yes, actually, although if you looked at me, you wouldn't believe it, I have worked for the NHS for over 50 years. And
Wow.
that's because I went to medical school in early 1970s. And even when we were at medical school in those days, you acted like a doctor even before you'd qualified. I even did a locum as a what would be called a resident doctor now when I was at medical school.
Right.
And you could prescribe medicines and everything, even in the hospital, as though I was a junior doctor.
There you go. There you go. Of course, they've just changed the name, haven't they? It used to be junior doctors, but I think resident is better, to be honest.
Yes, resident doctor. And actually, the poor old junior doctors do work many, many hours in hospital. So it's actually, they are a resident there.
Yeah, and also I think the word resident suggests that they're something less than doctors, and of course they're not. It's just it refers to more of a grading and scaling than anything else. So resident seems to make more sense. Um,
Yes.
I was talking to Leslie Turnberg, who you've heard of, is in the House of Lords at the moment, and he was telling a similar story in his early days that training was different to what it is now. Sort of-
Absolutely. And the hours were too. Although doctors and nurses complain of their long hours,
yeah.
in those days you did what was called a 1 in 2, which meant that you went to work at 8 o'clock in the morning and you didn't come home till about 6 o'clock the following day.
Yes.
So and then you had a bit of a rest and a sleep and you were back at work at eight
Yeah.
o'clock the next
Yeah,
morning.
absolutely. But also that sense in which you got a lot of responsibility very early on. But of course, medical training has really transformed, hasn't it? Sort of over the last, I suppose, 10 to 15 years. Would you recognize it now in comparison to your training? Oh, just bear with me. It's live, folks. I've got to go and get a parcel. 1 second. Stay there. I'll be right back. Real life interrupts. That was Amazon with a delivery. What's it like working from home these days? So, would you recognize the training now, do you think? Is it?
I would. And I did actually talk to GP, what you call registrars, which means they've been doctors for at least 2 years and they're in
Yeah.
training to be general practitioners last week. And what they wanted me to talk about was communication skills. So
Right.
I was talking to them about clever ways of communicating with patients because patients can be very intelligent or they can be from deprived populations where they're just not used to reading things.
Yeah.
They've not got any smartphone or anything like that.
Yeah.
And that kind of training about communication skills is all part of the passion of being a doctor and reaching out to whoever is coming to a consultation with you, or those people who should come to a consultation and they're keeping away from a doctor and
I
you've got
don't.
to reach them somehow.
Yeah, absolutely. Like a lot of blokes that are sort of need a bit more education on this stuff. You were a professor as well, looking at these types of issues, weren't you? About how do we encourage people to become, if you like, more expert in their own healthcare and well-being.
Yes, I've been a mixture of a GP on the front line
Yeah,
and an academic, but I've done that so that I could find out what's the best things to do,
yeah,
get some research about it, and then spread it. So I've gone, I don't know how many countries I've been over the sort of a 30-year period across the world
yeah.
sharing our learning from England and the UK. And that's meant that some of my books that I've written over the years have been translated into other languages. And even at the moment, I've got an old friend who's a professor in Japan who's asking his publisher if they can translate my book on that I've done with others on the menopause
Mm.
into Japanese, which again just shows you how in England we're ahead of the Japanese.
Well, I would say, I mean, I agree with you because when I first started my practice, I had a career and then I retrained and I moved into mental health work. And so about 30 years, just over 30 years ago, was when I started my practice. And I started in the NHS in psych wards and in social services, in social care, in social services as well. And I still to this day think it was the best training I ever had. I was working with people that, even to this day, are standout practitioners, real experts in what they were doing. And I learned a huge amount.
Yeah,
Subsequently, I'm now in the private sector, a bit like yourself. I work alongside statutory sector partners, but um, without a doubt, it was world class. And I would say probably still is, but I've been out of the NHS for a while. You're still more connected. Would you still suggest that we're up there leading? I know we've dropped in the rankings a little bit after COVID because of waiting times, but the UK has always been number one historically in the rankings in terms of health excellence, health
yeah.
delivery excellence.
We've actually gone a bit stagnant over healthy life expectancy
Right.
over the COVID times, but it's been going up. I mean, in Stoke-on-Trent, where done a lot of work, they're about to celebrate their centenary, 100 years since they've been called a city. So I look back at what was the life expectancy 100 years ago,
Mm.
and that was age 50. Now it's aged 80 something, whether
Yes.
you're a female or a male, even in a deprived area.
Wow.
So that's really telling you how we've improved over the last 100 years, but particularly over the last sort of 20 or 30 years, I would say. We now talk about healthy life expectancy as much as life expectancy.
But that's definitely what I'm working on as a personal project, is I want to extend my healthy life, not necessarily live 300 years, but I want to make sure that I'm investing in my exercise, my nutrition, my social relationships, and all those things that, like, I went for a hearing test the other day, just because I need to be on top of this stuff and making sure that I'm not falling into a problem without noticing. So
Yes,
I'm one of those people. I really take that on board because for me, I'm turning 60 in a couple of years' time, and it's a healthy life I want because I know we live longer. I don't want to be stuck on my sofa, unable to stand up. That's
yes,
just not my idea of fun. Um,
yeah.
can we go back a bit? Because we've got into, and I knew we would do this because we're just both interested in this stuff. Got straight into the meat and potatoes, as it were. Let's go back a little bit because I'm interested as to why and how people get into these fields. I always think it's an interesting story. So, did you grow up where you live now, or was it somewhere else? And can you tell us a little bit about that? Do you mind?
I grew up in an affluent area in Bowden in Cheshire, and my father was a managing director of an international company, But in those days, and we're now talking about when I was at school, the late 1960s,
Mm.
um, girls did not go to university.
Right.
So what my parents wanted for me was to be a bank clerk and work on a counter assistant. That was their big thing.
Hmm.
The only way I could stay on at my secondary school, which was a state school, as opposed to my brother who went to a private school,
Hmm.
was if I did science at in the sixth form,
Right.
which I had to do, even though I wanted to do English and history.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I did science. And again, the only way I could go to university would be if I did something that they considered worthwhile. Now, the day before we applied, the last deadline to apply at school to university, I still didn't know what I wanted to do. A friend put down medicine. I thought, well, if she can do it, I can do it. So I put down medicine as number one, pharmacy as number two, and in case my A levels were hopeless, I put agriculture. So what really amuses me now is that I got a place for pharmacy at Loughborough and
Right.
agriculture in Cheshire at a college, and I ended up doing medicine at Nottingham. And
Great.
medicine at Nottingham University was the first year they opened for that.
Yeah.
And whereas it was only 10% women allowed to be medical students across the UK, at Nottingham it was the first medical school to take 30% women.
Wow.
So that started me on my gender path.
It's extraordinary to think that that's the way we used to be structured, and what a waste of people and talent and lives. That I mean, it's just and you accidentally or you fought your way into this profession, have had a
Yeah.
long and honourable career in it, and helped thousands upon thousands of people. We could have missed out on that. It's just ridiculous way of organising society, isn't it?
Exactly, but it's also helped me to help people who are in my position, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
So I've helped a lot of refugee doctors, for instance, who come
Yes.
over,
Yeah.
and I've helped them on a one-to-one basis and raised money to train them as healthcare assistants in the
Yeah.
NHS, so they could learn about the NHS and learn English and take their very difficult tests, English and medicine on the side. And
Yeah.
it's that kind of background that's enabled me to really help people who are absolutely struggling and think they can't make it. And I'm a, yes, you can, give it a go, give it a go. And those six refugees that I just talked about then, doctors, they're all practicing
Yeah.
in Staffordshire or Derbyshire, and they're all huge assets to the NHS now, but otherwise they could have been working in warehouses.
I know it's. I remember refugee doctors, the organisations. I did a lot of work with refugees when I was in social services, actually, before the government had responsibility for messing it up.
Yeah,
Local authorities, and we did the best we could. It was a lot better than the government had been doing, I'm telling you. There were far less riots when we were in charge, and far less problems, to be honest, because we did a lot about integration and a
yeah,
lot about doing what you're saying, which is you're only looking at one side of that story, which is what you think of as the negative and the burden. Actually, the type of refugee that was coming to the UK always has been much more educated and middle class people because poor working class people can't make it.
no. And
I mean,
a
it's so
lot,
ridiculous.
they've run for their lives. I
Yeah,
mean, the two of the ones from Afghanistan, I know, had been hiding up trees
yeah,
for days because
yeah,
the Taliban wanted to cut off their hands
yeah.
because they wouldn't cut
Because they
off the
were
hands.
doctors. That's
Yeah.
why.
They
That's
wanted to cut off their hands because they wouldn't cut off the hands of people that the Taliban thought had done wrong.
yeah. And it was always really distressing to me, it still is, to see this demonization of people that had shown extraordinary courage
Yeah,
and resilience.
yes,
And to be honest, I think we need to celebrate it, not demonize it, and
yeah,
celebrate the skills. But it was a long time ago that we made very bizarre decisions around people coming to the country not being able to fend for themselves. And then we pointed at them and said, well, why are you a burden on the state? Because we made them a burden on the state.
yes.
It's very strange, isn't it? It's sort
Well,
of,
a lot of it is teaching them English language skills, if they're going to be able to be fit for employment.
yeah.
And that's where I brought my husband in, and made him get an English teaching qualification from our local Keele University. And he's still teaching refugee and asylum seekers now, 20 years on.
Brilliant. Absolutely fantastic. That's what we need more of in the UK, as far as I'm concerned. So where did you get that fighting spirit from then? You weren't going to put up with being a girl bank clerk with no hope. Where does that come from?
I
Um,
think I think I've just always had it as the gender issues
did
were
you?
kind of dished on me over the years.
Did you
And
always see it as unfair and wrong?
yes, yeah. And I've always been full of, well, I think I'll make a decision on this rather than be
Good for
bossed
you.
about. And most people like me for that,
Yeah,
but some people, especially as you get jobs where you're answering to management who do not want you to say what you think and they want you to cooperate, I'm afraid I've always thought when I was about 50, I used to think when I'm 55, I'll stop being a doctor and I'll run a national charity. And as
right.
I got nearer to 55, I thought, no, I can't just be nice to the government all the time. I won't be able to run a national charity. I'll be wrecking it.
Ah,
So I forgot that role and I carried on as a doctor and an
well,
academic.
good for you. Like, we don't need to be nice to the government, whoever they are. And some governments we need to be a bit closer to than others, maybe.
Yeah,
Sort of like, now, so you have this sense of justice and injustice, I guess,
yeah.
but it's very much a personal thing that you bring to your work, and it leads to you standing up for the rights of people who are less well off, and sort of why do you bring that in, and why is it important, do you think, in terms of healthcare and supporting people?
Well, I think if we're going to what's happening at the moment in the way that general practice and other health is delivered, one of the things that has grown with me over the years is to respect everybody in the team.
Right.
So at the moment, we have a lot more new roles in general practice, and we have paramedics and social prescribers who've moved into general
Yeah.
practice teams as paid for by the government with what they call the additional roles reimbursement scheme and clinical pharmacists.
Mhm.
Now, we've got to be really sure that the roles they do are within their limitations.
Yeah.
And we're also got to be really sure that the roles they do exploit all their positive contributions. And so I've definitely been, well, I've been helping along, underpinning a lot of that over the last sort of 10, 15 years. I was very keen on the Foundation for Integrated Care, which was founded, I don't know, 15 years ago. And that they've promoted social prescribers ever since. And social prescribers are people who are not registered nurses or doctors, but they
Mhm.
have a lot of frontline interactions with members of the general public. And we need to start from there,
Mhm.
right to the top with the doctors, whether that's any settings they're in, to make sure that we're making the most of the doctors, not having to do basic skills, and making sure, though, that it's all done within professionalism and safety and security for patients.
I get that. I mean, there's no argument from me. I'm a regulated professional with the Health and Care Professions Council. You know what that means. The statutory professional regulation and working within your competencies is absolutely crucial. And I'm all for that rolling out much more, to be honest, and
Yes,
people understanding. And one of the things I get from registration, to be honest, is the fact that I can say no to requests that are outside of my professional capacities and towards requests that I think would make somebody unsafe. And so I don't have to worry about that. I suppose one of the issues is it's about supervision of people who come into these environments
yes,
and maybe don't have those boundaries and those understandings of saying no, and who are just actually just want to be helpful is my experience.
yes. But I've done a project recently because I tend to bid for some money and get some projects going locally. And one of the things I've been very passionate about is finding people who've got an irregular heart rate called atrial fibrillation and don't know they've got it. So when I got some funding in the winter of 23, 24, then we trained doctors and nurses to use what you call the AliveCore device, which you can do in 30 seconds and find out with two thumbs on it whether or not someone's got an irregular heart rate. And a person can do that. It hasn't
Yeah,
got to be in a doctor's environment.
yeah,
But we also trained the social prescribers,
yeah.
and they found about a quarter of the new cases of atrial fibrillation. And over that very short period of 3 months, by just having it in their pocket, the social prescribers, the nurses, the GPs, and just checking when people had a flu jab and that sort of thing, they found 130 confirmed new cases of atrial fibrillation
Mhm.
in Mia, which is a deprived area. And I showed the results to somebody who works in London. Well done, Ruth. You've saved 4 strokes in the next 12 or 18 months. So
Mhm.
it's all that kind of thing that we need to use all the staff to do our work in the way that's safe, but
But
also
it's
reaches out.
also, I mean, I get it on a practical level, but let's look at it a bit more conceptually because it's a very different way of thinking about health and well-being to maybe the beginnings of the NHS, which is you're ill, you went to the doctor, they gave you something, and that made you well. But we're definitely not there anymore. So can you like try to explain? I mean, some people may not know terms like social prescribing, etc., etc. So let's try and look at some of those things and try and weave in this notion of the question of social justice, which is there as well. So why why is it okay for GPs now to be doing, or GP practices, if you like, to be doing these things? Why is it important that we have these other roles in them? What do they bring and what do they make us think about in terms of healthcare and health and well-being?
Well, for me, the focus on the NHS surviving is prevention.
Yes.
And although that does feature in like the national plans for the NHS. There was one themes that were put out about a month ago that was like, number one, get the waiting list down at hospital, and number three was prevention. Well, you can't get the waiting list down in a hospital
I know.
unless you are really going to
You go
prevent.
upstream, don't you? You have to go upstream
Absolutely.
and cut off the source, if as it were.
And so very much it's often what the other members of staff now in the teams can be helping with that prevention ethos and the priority to for people to understand that they're not well
Yeah.
and then to realize what they can do to stop the condition progressing.
Okay.
And that might be lifestyle changes, but it might be taking medication. And I'm doing a project at the moment with chronic kidney disease.
Okay.
And they say that 7.2 million adults in the UK at the moment have chronic kidney disease,
Yeah.
and there's only about 1/4 of them know it. And so, what we've got to do is to be starting to do a few more blood tests and urine tests on the people who are at risk, and they're the people with diabetes or high blood pressure, maybe overweight, and finding out what is there a problem and what can we do about it.
It's interesting because there are parallels in terms of mental health, for example. Do you need to sort that light out? Is it
Um,
blinding you?
yeah, I was just thinking, if I put that across, that might be better.
Got ya. That's you okay there?
Oh, I think we could say that I can solve all the problems.
Yeah, there you go.
Light in my eyes,
I'm going
put
to
the
make
blind
you the
up.
prime minister tomorrow, or maybe the president of the US. I prefer you in that role, to be honest.
No,
I think
thank
you'd make a
you.
definitely better job of that one, to be honest. Um, so this thing of like looking at this thing in the whole, because you said it's about the survival of the NHS, and I agree. I think what you mean by that, and you tell me if I'm wrong, is that if we keep on just the disease model, treating illness and disease and making bigger and bigger hospitals. Eventually, we're all just in a big hospital and we can't afford it, and that's it, you know.
Yeah,
But we have to do something else. And then you've also talked about this idea of all these different roles can be, you can cross fertilize and give people some basic training in this so that they can spot things at an earlier stage,
yeah,
the earlier. Now, you were bringing in the idea of educating people about that health and well-being, what that means, because lifestyle attitudes may mask illness
yes,
and lifestyle behaviors may mask illness.
yes,
And so we need to do something about that in the context of prevention. Now, that's very true in mental health. We do a lot of what's called psychological education. We teach people, we give them information. So cognitive behavioral therapy, as you know, one of the cornerstones of it is psych ed, which is about telling people what anxiety looks like, what depression looks like, what the symptoms are, how you manage it yourself, and
yeah,
framing it so that it's understandable.
yeah,
And then often that will be enough for people in terms of treatment. They go and self-manage very successfully and don't want
yeah.
anybody else involved. Is there a similar sort of way of thinking about sort of medical health as well? Not that I split the two, but is this what you're suggesting, that we need to get a bit more educated around this stuff?
Absolutely. And I have gone out to a lot of community groups over the last 2 years with different funding that I've had, like the Shared Prosperity Fund from the government that's been allocated to
Yeah,
councils. Um, and so, say the theme is menopause,
yeah,
then we end up talking about physical and mental health. And what I usually do is to take along some cards with me that
yeah,
describe some trusted NHS or charity based apps,
yeah.
and that they aren't the kind of apps where you think they're free, you get on for 10 seconds and suddenly you've got to
And
pay a lot
suddenly you
of
have got a
money.
70 quid bill. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And that or their trusted websites.
Yeah,
Um, we've also delivered this kind of thing in the local libraries, and the libraries that we've got in Stoke-on-Trent have got computers in them. And if people haven't got and can't know how to access it, there's a certain time of the day when some of the library staff will be there to
yeah,
help them use the computers and get on the apps. Now, CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy, like you said, has been one of the most popular, but people have got so much out of a lot of the other, say, menopause linked or mental health linked.
yeah, yeah,
That even when we do, I don't know, the Calm app and the various other mental
yeah,
health
yeah, yeah,
apps,
yeah.
then we'll also be pulling in things that are the Couch to 5K app to
I've used that
encourage
myself
people.
actually when I first started running. It was brilliant. I can't say enough. There's another one which I think is really important, which is the drink aware stuff that the
Yes.
NHS has produced. Amazing stuff, because most people have no idea how
And
much
they're
they're drinking and what it actually means. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, and they're simple. And if
Yeah,
we're talking about drinking and you'd like a bit of a laugh, that about just before COVID, I was doing an app that I'd got some funding for to
yeah,
show people how to take their pulse by feeling their wrist and seeing if it's regular or irregular.
right.
I had started going to Wetherspoons for breakfast in those days, and I looked around and thought some of the people here need to be checking their pulse as they sat there with a few
With a
pints of
big fry
tea.
up and a pint. Yes.
Yeah. And so I wrote to Tim Martin, I emailed him and I managed to guess his correct email address, and he let us put those apps on drink mats. We put them all across the Staffordshire
Brilliant.
pubs.
Brilliant.
And within 2 weeks, the installation of the app had gone up by 2,000.
Yeah.
And then COVID came and we couldn't get it out across the rest of the UK.
Right.
So in the book that I've recently published about my career in the RNHS and thinking, I've got a cartoon of a Spoons pub in there with cheap beer and free health advice.
But no, it's really interesting, and I think it's really interesting to look at this and the whole sort of technology stuff, which is again, there's some wonderful things that are really positive about it. And I've been an early adopter of stuff,
Yes,
as well as some risks. And you touched upon the risk. So you use the word trusted sources, right?
yes.
So tell me what that means so that people understand what a trusted source is, because there are some significant issues, aren't there, out there?
Well, I suppose I just keep it simple in my mind. And trusted sources to me are NHS based
Yeah,
or charity based, like the British Menopause Society or Kidney Research UK. Um, and that's really, but then if we're also saying trusted sources, another thing that came to mind while you were talking is that as a GP, I was a trusted source.
right.
And I can remember someone came up to me in a shop the other day and said, "Oh, Doctor, you don't remember me, do you?" Well, I always play safe. And I say, "Oh, yeah, of course I do." He was like about 25. I said, "What job are you doing now?" Because that's a sort of
Yeah,
easy
yeah, yeah,
thing.
absolutely.
And he told me, he said, "But it wouldn't be for you, Doctor. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing it." And it all came back to me. He'd come out of prison. His family had disowned him. He'd been suicidal, and I'd been seeing him every week for about 2 months or so. Now, come on, you can do it. You took the blame for your friends and you
Yeah,
went,
yeah.
that's not fair. And he was really telling me that 2 years later or 3 years later, he's alive, very happy, and thanks to me because I was the trusted person
Yeah.
who managed to overcome all the negativity that he was getting from everyone else, which was lovely.
And there's quite a lot of evidence, particularly around GPs, that often patients may hold on to some stuff for a long time. They go to
Yeah,
the GP, it all comes out. And the GP often is the person who can do the signposting and the referral. And those referrals stick because the GP has the phone, gives it to the patient,
yeah.
and they go and get the service immediately. That sort of trusted source. And we're on the other side, we have a lot of people using these new technologies and media who are not trusted sources and are creating havoc, I would say, real problems around sort of misinformation. And we saw the rise of that during COVID as well, that there was a misinformation around, and we're beginning to see some issues around vaccination, for example, people being worried about vaccination. Um,
Yes.
what else, apart from the sort of NHS, apart from websites, etc., what might be other things that you think people need to look out for in terms of when they're looking at information? Because there's so much out there at the moment.
Well, there is, and obviously people bring AI into it, and I'm not an expert on
No,
that.
no, no.
But I do read like articles, and again, I am referencing my book, but not to really promote it, just as a thing that the person who helped put it together for me for Amazon, as a bit of a joke, he put the whole thing through Chat GPT,
Right.
and 5 or 10 minutes later, it had read the whole of the 70,000 words, and it come up with the ethos of what was in there. And I was so impressed because it actually described it in an interpretive, descriptive way rather than just some sentences.
Yeah.
And he also asked it, what did Boris Johnson think of it? And what did Shakespeare think of it? And again, there was these different versions. And wow, so I am very aware that there's a lot coming from AI,
Mhm.
but at the moment, I've just got that little bit of uncertainty, and then yeah, we'll wait and see. And I just read when I look at evidence, I'm looking at what does the NICE guidelines say. Other people who spent a lot of years going through all the evidence.
Yeah.
Um, and I was on a NICE guidance committee once, so I've got more insights into how
I think
people do
NICE is
look at the
brilliant. They
evidence.
make the guidance very simple. People that don't know, it's the National Institute of Health and Clinical Excellence. And you can literally Google NICE treatments, cancer, and it'll give you all the information in a very accessible manner. Um,
Yes,
the other thing I think about, and I wonder what you think about this, it's about the accountability of the person giving you the information.
yes.
Accountability for that. If they make a mistake, where would you go?
Exactly. And I'm always careful when I write stuff to put a disclaimer on it so that
Yeah,
they can't blame me. But the disclaimer is usually times change. There may be some, since I wrote this 6 months ago, there might be new evidence. And it's all that kind of thing that people need to be aware of. If they're reading something from 2 years ago, there might be different evidence with different recommendations now.
yeah. So tell me more about prevention and why you're passionate about that. Because it recently, I think, didn't Keir Starmer start talking about that? And maybe he's talking about it seriously. I mean, it's been one of those subjects that has been talked about in healthcare for ever since I've been around, which is quite a while now. And nobody's ever really done anything about it, apart from these moves into things like social prescribing and lifestyle medicine and all that sort of stuff. But at the moment, the vast majority of the budget, the health budget, is still on, chopping people's legs off because they've got diabetes, as opposed to stopping the diabetes in the first place, right?
Yeah.
So, what's your vision in terms of what do you think needs to happen in terms of prevention and the future of that way of working?
Well, I mean, obviously, the answer has got to be people to have healthy lifestyles, but you've got to make them understand that. And many, many years ago, I did some consultancy down in a very posh area near Oxfordshire, and
Yeah,
I couldn't believe the difference in life expectancy there compared to Stoke-on-Trent was about 10 to 15 years
what's it?
between people. Now, most of that is down to the unhealthy lifestyle habits of people living in deprived areas, and that could be smoking, obesity, and drinking too much alcohol, and maybe illicit drugs.
Okay,
So obviously, one's got to be aware of all that, but we've also got to make people, if you think how many people are either overweight or obese, and as a guess, I think it's something like 70% of the British adults aged over 40 or so, then that's absolutely awful because
mm,
that's bringing on diabetes they wouldn't otherwise have had,
yeah,
a higher blood pressure, etc., and cancer.
mm,
So somehow we've got to get through to the, it's about all of us making preventive changes,
mm,
not just healthcare professionals or social care professionals saying, bad news stories to them. It's
And do you
actually,
think
we're
it's a
all responsible.
do you think it's a social responsibility as well? Because I
Absolutely.
mean, I think the old model of treatment of disease meant that you would divorce that from how people were living and just go, oh, right, you've got this, you've got blood clots. Let's sort those out, as opposed to looking at other issues. But in terms of,
Absolutely.
if we think about things like, for example, smoking cessation, that's that's been a very complicated. I suppose one of the most successful forms of health intervention I can think of in the UK, in many ways, that
Yes.
by many organisations and bodies, including central government, working on encouraging people to reduce the levels at which they smoke, which has worked. And certainly,
Yeah.
we look at with children, for example, the since 2015, the number of young people starting smoking has dropped by 20%. And we know if you never start, it's unlikely to be a problem, right? So
But vaping has gone up, hasn't it?
it's and that's often a stepping stone, isn't it? So we
Yes.
need to think about that. There's other issues around vaping, but in terms of that approach, which is a public health approach, if you like, and that's been a very successful public health program, is this what we're talking about, say, for obesity? So would we be looking at, so that's, if we think about that approach, it's including things like pricing cigarettes out of the market, and that's the
Yes.
truth. They've just put loads of tax on it, and that has discouraged people from smoking as much or from taking up smoking in the first place.
Yes.
Would there be similar types of approaches, you think, as a doctor, that you think would be you would welcome?
Well, they have already tried, which I don't see it working, to put the calorie content on food and some drinks. When for almost any cafe or restaurant you go to,
Yeah,
it's usually got the calorie content there,
yeah,
but people seem to ignore it. Whereas, which is very odd, isn't it? Because I don't think that's made any. My impression is it's not made any
yeah,
impact at all.
yeah, yeah,
So somehow we've got to, like we're having this conversation now, get people more aware of the damage they are doing to every part of their body
yeah,
by having what you call a body mass index more
yeah.
than 25 or even lower than that if you're from an Asian ethnicity.
Yeah. And so what role do you think the government has in terms of, say, for example, people have talked about having a sugar tax, for example. Would you see that as useful and helpful as somebody who's had to
Well,
deal with the other side of it?
the problem is about that kind of thing is I'm so aware of people who are in deprived areas who've
Yeah.
just got no money.
Yeah.
Um, so I think all we can do really is more awareness and maybe more personalities who can sort of make people believe that it's worth them doing it. Maybe some more famous people who we
Yeah.
could get leading as role players and so on.
So again, we come back to that conversation about social justice, I guess. That
Yes,
there is an issue here that, poverty is of real impact on people's health and well-being, and we know that. And poverty is probably one of the biggest drivers of ill health in many ways. And so, if we're going to have this sea change, would it be useful to have that conversation about how we're looking at those types of issues and sort of the improvements in people's life chances are actually an improvement in their health and well-being?
and a lot of that means investing in social care. And
Right.
I went to a conference in Manchester about 3 weeks ago, and they had an important person doing for 20 minutes or so, who is the chair of what they call an integrated care board there.
Yeah.
And he talked for about 20 minutes about the health service and mentioned social care once. And that whole idea of what he was talking about was about how prevention and how we improve the future and make it sustainable. One mention of social
That's
care.
quite strange. I find that really strange that somebody would still be not getting the message. Why is social care important, do you think? What does it bring in terms of your experience as a doctor?
Well, social care is out there with all the population, and many of the population they're interacting with
Yeah.
are have got very poor lifestyle habits, so they're
Yes.
ideal ambassadors. Obviously, probably quite a lot of people in social care have got got an unfortunate lifestyle themselves. So, but so it's all on all of us really, health and social
Quite,
care to
quite a
be
lot of doctors as well, to be honest.
exactly, yeah,
Physician, heal thyself. But that's the important point, isn't it? That they have
yeah,
the relationship with people who need the help. who you're
Yes.
not going to see until they're in a chronic or some acute inflammation phase, etc. But you won't get to see them. But if you can work with those people, similar, I suppose, to what you're saying about the social prescribers, teaching them some basic health skills so that they can identify certain things earlier and encourage people to seek expert medical help.
Yes.
What do you think about? And there's a thing called lifestyle medicine. Have you come across that?
I think yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I know some of the sort of friends I have who are health doctors are sort of big fans of it. And that talks about significant changes in the way we do life. So learning relaxation for stress management, good social network, exercise, a reasonable diet, and good sleep. I don't think people realize how important sleep is in terms of health and well-being. What's your thoughts about that and about us introducing those types of approaches more into healthcare?
I completely agree. And quite often when people retire, they don't quite know what to do with themselves. And if
Yeah.
they can get to sort of some more interesting clubs, I met a friend the other day who's now in a croquet club, but she's like age 70 and she's doing a bridge club, so that helps her. And she's doing swimming sort of competition almost, even though she's not
Super.
quite
Well
good
done.
at swimming. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
that's
so
really good.
that's brought her in with a whole different lots of groups of people
Yeah,
that she finds very interesting and they meet up as well for coffee or whatever. But it's also giving her physical, different physical things to do and different
yeah.
mental things to do.
And
And
we
so
know
she's
that
celebrating.
loneliness
Yeah.
is a really significant problem in healthcare.
Yeah. So she's having a very happy life now compared to 2 or 3 years ago.
Is that true of you? Now you've so-called retired. Not quite sure what you mean by retired.
Well, I've booked my retirement, I think when I'm 85 and I'm okay
Okay, all
carrying
right,
on at the
that's fine.
moment. Yeah.
There's a while to go.
Yeah.
So tell us about the current work that you're doing and the book that you've written and what sort of decided that you wanted to write this book. So what is it called, first of all, the book?
It's called RNHS for better or worse?
Yeah,
Question mark.
yeah,
Um, and I've just tried to pull out my experiences over the last 50 years of working in the NHS.
yeah,
And I just went with whatever chapters interested me.
yeah,
So gender, as you can imagine, because we've been talking about it, was one of them. And even now, you see, take gender. I've told you that in my day, there were very few lady doctors. I was speaking to a consultant who's age 60 the other day, who's in obs and gynae, and her patients still think she's a nurse, and the junior resident doctors standing behind her are the consultant. So
right.
there is still a lot of gender discrimination, etc., current in the health service.
But it also, I mean, it's more than just that as well, the cold face, because there's decisions about what research gets done, for example. And
Yes,
so there was a new research that came out that looked at heart rate variability, I think, and an indicator of when you're going to give birth. And it's apparently a much more subtle indicator. 2 weeks, the 2 weeks prior to birth, your
yes,
heart rate variability suddenly changes. And so a much better way of helping women sort of predict when they're going to be born is give them a Fitbit or something like that, and they can
yes. So
measure.
that there are good things to do. That's right.
Yeah.
I'd also written
But
about
but we only know that because we've got more women doctors in the field who actually have an interest in that.
yes.
And
There's
that's the way
now
it works, right?
first time there are more women doctors than male doctors on the General Medical Council register.
Wow.
But what I would like to know is how many of them are full-time and how does that vary between the male and female doctors? Because actually that might still mean that you've got more chance of seeing a male doctor than a female doctor if
Yeah.
more work part-time.
Yeah, well, the chances are that if they're women doctors, they are women as well, and they've got families and they take on
Yes,
those obligations. So they have more flexible working approaches. And
yes,
we've also seen, and there's another, again, just thinking about structural issues, even though in the UK, most families are two income families, the
yeah,
father and the mother, it's still dad's money that's relied on most. And the
yes,
things that have changed that, and it's interesting, the things that have gone to more women being in the workforce are literally the health, education, and social care sectors.
yes.
As they've been
What?
invested, they've supported women coming into work and being able to sort of contribute economically.
Well, I've, as you know, stood up for women and so on. And so when I first had my children, I did a deal with my husband that he stayed at home as a
Yeah.
house husband, and I went to work because I needed to carry on finishing my general practice training. He would then find when he took one of the children to play school, they wouldn't let him in because the
Yeah,
women,
I know that stuff. I mean, 30 years ago, I was working with new fathers, and they would often tell me that you'd see these groups called
yeah,
toddler and parent, and they weren't. They were toddler and mum. And
yeah.
as dads, they were definitely not welcome.
Yeah, it's just how things were then. But I also did a chapter on going into prisons because I'm now a lay observer of people in custody.
Yeah,
I did one on prescription fraud because I gradually realized that somewhere I was working, there was prescription fraud going
yeah,
on.
yeah,
I couldn't get the evidence to report them to the police. So about 5 years later, the Department of Health, I heard, was looking for someone with a clinical lead for prescription fraud. And so I had an interview over the phone, told them all the things I knew. I was straight away taken on. And then I
right.
was into the cabinet office in Downing Street and everything, which, um, I was pretty young at the time.
Yeah,
So that
yeah,
was quite a way of me realizing what a lot I'd got to contribute.
yeah. And what else is in the book so that people can have some sense of it?
Um, then obviously I've done a chapter as well on digital healthcare
Yeah,
and how it's changed over the years because I've done quite a lot. At one stage, I even went over to Washington about 2014, I think it was,
yeah,
promoting a new app in those days and Flow Telehealth, and we were way ahead of
yeah.
others in Washington. So I've also been praising all like the robot surgery and so on that's going on now, which
It's
is
extraordinary stuff, isn't it?
fantastic. Yeah.
There was a an operation that happened the other week where the doctor was over the other side of the planet, and it was done remotely via robots. And
Yeah, no, they have this Da Vinci robots locally now at Royal Stoke Hospital, and I've been
brilliant.
praising them because what happens then when you have robot surgery? It might take a little bit longer, but the one I know about, which was my husband, he was out in one day, whereas most people were kept after the surgery for 4 days.
Yeah,
So
quite.
it actually saves a lot of money.
Yeah, and also, to be honest, being in a hospital is the last place I'd want to be to get well. It's not
Exactly,
they're
yes.
not great environments for your health.
No, you want to get right
The
out if
sooner
you
you get
can,
out, the better. Do you know what I
as
mean?
soon as you
Um,
can.
so, where can people
Whistleblowing, I
find?
had a chapter on whistleblowing
Yeah,
because I think we have got, which is kind of some of what we've talked about today. You've got to be listening to people
yeah.
who can see problems and not just dismiss them.
Well, we've got Shipman, we've got Let Be, etc. There are all sorts of issues that need to be highlighted, and the practitioners behind those headlines have all said the same thing, that they try to raise issues, but it's squashed by certain levels of management, and so there
Yeah.
needs to be a way for people to come out of that and be protected, which is the whole point about whistleblowing.
Well, I was a whistleblower 2007 and I
Right,
gave him a notice in, but at one stage my husband had me a sort of recorder which I had in my bra to try and capture what people were saying.
right.
But whenever I managed to get them talking about it, they went on for too long and I exceeded the time of what I had the recorder.
You
But
need some training from the FBI, mate. That's what you got to do. Get that training in first, and how to get them to confess.
so
Um,
I did my PhD on doctors' stress, and obviously
right.
overcoming stress is not just for doctors these days, it's
Yeah.
teachers and or almost every profession.
Yeah. What in that sense, over the years, because it's not a healthy profession. Healthcare and social care are not healthy professions. Same with education. High rates of what are called presenteeism as opposed to absenteeism. People turning up when they shouldn't, to be honest, when they should be taken. What would you say in terms of your experience of being a busy medic over these years and now a busy sort of retiree, sort of what have you done to keep yourself well over that period of time?
I think I always put limits on things.
Right.
So I had I had two meetings this morning and they were both quite straining. So I had about an hour before we talked today
Yeah.
and I went for a walk, even though I got quite a bit of work. Who cares about work? I went for a walk in the
Good for
sunshine.
you. Good for you. I mean, I think that's right. I totally agree. These days, I have my own company, so I get to write my sort of diary. And if I don't feel well, I'm definitely not going to push myself
Yeah,
beyond what I need to, and I'm going to take time out. This morning, I went for a walk in the park with a friend and
yeah,
their little son.
yeah,
Best medicine I can think of, to be honest, is that and sort of getting out there. We were feeding the ducks, which was always great fun.
yeah, lovely. And now you're thinking about them, you can picture them and,
And
all that
it's
sort of
I'm
thing.
getting all those reward hormones.
Yeah.
Um, in terms of like the NHS, you call it our NHS, and it is interesting. We do feel that way about it. Why do you think we feel so emotionally attached to our NHS? Why?
I think that the ethos that's given out if you go to the doctor is we're in this together.
Yeah,
I'm not telling you what to do. We need to work out what you're prepared to do for your overweight or your drinking. I'm not sitting there with wagging my finger at you. And that's all part of the ethos. Even as you go to hospital, you're given options to
yeah,
think about what would suit you. The better informed you are before you go, the better. I did a booklet recently on the menopause, and someone gave it to their client. And then I got the feedback about a day later saying this lady had gone for an obs and gynae appointment and she ended up with a different outcome than she would have had if she'd not read the booklet about what the menopause is and what the treatment
yeah,
options are.
yeah.
So it's all about that informed consent, and you're a team, you patient, you family, you health professional.
And I would add, if you don't mind, that it's also about health isn't one thing. It's about something you're doing throughout your life. And there are certain things you can tolerate now that you might have not have been able to tolerate yesterday or the week before, certain changes that you need to make.
Yes.
One very simple example is, for example, people with trauma symptoms may drink too much, but actually it is working for them in some ways, managing some of those suicidal impulses. And until you've got other better coping mechanisms in place, it's unlikely that coping mechanism around the alcohol will go away. And you probably don't want it to go away until they've got the other better coping mechanisms in place. And it's that sort of balance you seem to be arguing for, is that that's what we're looking at as a when real people come with real health issues. It's not here's a pill, this is magic, this is what's going to work for this human being.
Yes. And that's partly how a general practice or a general practice nurse is. They're thinking of the 360-degree issues rather than just that one tiny thing that you must stop this. It's the whole person thing.
Now, it seems to me that our NHS is a labour of love and that you've committed your life to healthcare through the NHS and warts and all. Do you still think it's worth saving? Do you still think it's important?
Oh, yes, I do. Um, we've all got to strive for it to keep it going.
Yeah. With the recent changes, the closure of NHS England, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, and about whether that's welcome or not welcome.
I think it's given people a real shock,
Right.
and people are worried about the people who are important in the NHS England and what's going to happen to their work path, the
Yeah.
programs they've got underway. So we've got to be absolutely careful not to lose the assets that we've got, just that happen to be a government edict.
Yeah.
Um, so I just hope all that background stuff is going on.
Okay. And is it worth keeping the NHS for the future? Do you still love it with a passion that you have done throughout your life so far?
Absolutely, yes. That's really why I keep on doing these projects at the moment.
Super. Look, Ruth, it's been beautiful to have you with us. Thank you so much. Where can people get hold of your book? Did you hear me?
No.
Where can people get
Oh,
hold of your book if they want to?
it's on Amazon
Right.
as a paperback or as a Kindle.
Great.
So
And
you just
so,
need to look at Ruth Chambers, RNHS,
okay.
for better or worse.
And do you go and meet groups and talk to them about health and well-being as well? Are you available in that sense about going to see somebody's workplace, for example, and having a chat about it? about what you do and your experience of healthcare.
I've been doing it in Staffordshire. I mean, I went to like Women's on Probation as well as Staffordshire Aid. So
Right.
sometimes I've gone to the trusts as well,
And
like
how might
yourself.
people, if they're interested, if they see you and they want to maybe have a conversation with you about that sort of stuff, how
Yep.
might they get hold of you?
Well, I've got a personal website,
Yeah,
www.ruthchambers.co.uk,
yeah,
and I have a CIC with others, which is www.raparu, raparu.co.uk.
super. That's fantastic. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you and have you on the show. And thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful time away. I know you've got a couple of weeks away, so really enjoy yourself and do not take the computer.
But I'll be thinking of lots of ideas while I'm away, and when I come back, guess what? I'll make them happen.
Great. But you've got an old guy to take with you and look after him. So you got something to distract you while you're there. So don't worry.
He can carry my luggage and all that sort of thing. Pay the
Okay.
bills.
You stay there. Thanks for joining us. Folks, I hope you got some insight into the sort of passion and commitment that drives the NHS in the UK. And I certainly think that we need to be involved in our NHS, not just as an institution, but because it's broader than that about our health and well-being. And it's about engaging in that actively and understanding what that means to us as individuals, and not expecting just a prescription, which is, even if that prescription is these days a group, which is great, I think, much better than just tablets. So thanks for joining us, Ruth. Hope you all enjoyed it. Do reach out to Ruth if you want to get some information. Definitely worth getting hold of her book at this point in time as we go through all these transitions and changes to inform yourself about what's being suggested about our NHS. And lovely to have you here, Ruth. You stay there, and I'll see you all at the next show. So bye bye for now.
Bye.